Because if you do the math on meetings, most senior people spend at least 50% of their time in meetings. And so the math on this, if you're spending 50% of your time in meetings and only working 8 hours a day, you will literally spend a year's worth of your life in hours in meetings in under 9 years. So if you have a 40-year career, you're probably going to spend 5 years of your life literally in meetings.
That's very depressing.
It's very depressing.
Welcome to the Product Agility Podcast, the missing link between agile and product. The purpose of this podcast is to share practical tips, strategies, and stories from world-class thought leaders and practitioners. Why, I hear you ask? Well, I want to increase your knowledge and your motivation to experiment so that together we can create ever more successful products. My name is Ben Maynard, and I'm your host. What has driven me for the last decade to bridge the gap between agility and product is a deep-rooted belief that people and products evolving together can achieve mutual excellence.
Welcome back to the Product Agility Podcast. I am your host, Ben Maynard, and today I am joined by Evan Unger. Now, Evan is a gentleman who is, and I'm trying to think how he's described on another podcast, like a master and guru of facility. I can't remember how, on that construction podcast, do you remember how they introduced you? Because it was pretty good.
I can't remember what he did, but something like that. He was
good. Professional, unlike me. I'll put a link to that episode in the description so you can hear how they introduced it. Evan is here because at some point you're having to get people to work together on something, and there's an element of facilitation that comes in with that, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, is the ins and outs of having a fantastic facilitative experience, and Evan's going to bestow some of his wisdom on us. But before we get into the meat of the episode, Evan, would you care to share a little bit about yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, thank you, Ben, for having me here. I suppose I've got to think early on, my dad worked for IBM for 30 years, and the thing that I remember from my childhood, many things, was how drained my dad came home from work. And the funny thing is, I ended up going to business school and pretty much did the same thing my dad did. I joined a large multinational company, Merck, big pharmaceutical company. And when you're inside a large company, you're in all these meetings, and it's rather perplexing. And so I went through a series of rotational leadership roles. They liked what I was doing. I felt like an imposter. But the next thing I knew, they invented this job for me called the Director of Change, Leadership, and Development, which honestly was a fancy title for I had no idea what I was doing. I'm 4 years out of business school. A new CEO comes on board, and he does an assessment of the organization. And there's a big push for collaboration. And I got on a big project, a big re-engineering project. And what we did was design a program to teach very senior people complex collaborative facilitation skills, and went incredibly well. And ended up leaving Merck after about 6 years, work for a small firm now called Schwartz Associates. And what we've done for 30 years is run cultural interventions, trying to transform the culture. As part of those interventions, of course, we always have to facilitate multi-day workshop type meetings, team building, visioning, strategic planning, process redesign type meetings. And as part of those interventions, we always train people to do the same thing because we want real skill transfer. So we're really focused on high stakes collaborative workshop meetings. I would say most companies, one of the efforts they need to take is to figure out how to reduce the number of meetings, because there are so many meetings that are deadly. And Patrick Lencioni wrote that book, Death by Meeting. We're running bad meetings. It leads to bad decisions. So many meetings are a waste of time. And people, they don't hate meetings. What they hate is wasting their time. So that's what I've done for 30 years. And recently, we've started teaching people how to run meetings on a screen like we're in, these hybrid virtual meetings. And it is a weird thing to be sitting in these tiles and trying to get work done. But the world's changed since the pandemic, and that's what people are faced with.
It was a challenge before, and I think now it's a greater challenge. I think for some non-obvious reasons as well, but maybe if we have time, we can explore some of that. Now, there's a few things you said there, which what's the word I'm looking for? Hung on to a little bit. You said about the complex collaborative facilitation skills, which sounded awesome, and I'd like to learn more about that. You mentioned high-stakes collaborative workshops. I think that, again, I think that's a good thing to explore, because I think that maybe if it isn't high stakes, then maybe why are we doing it? And you mentioned facilitating workshops around visioning and team building. So there's a lot of stuff we can explore there, and maybe to get us going, because I think I spent a long time, as listeners know, working in large organizations and seeing lots of people turning up to agile events, even product visioning workshops, road mapping workshops, and they didn't want to be there. The organization had decided to go on a particular journey, had decided that they were going to have these certain workshops, these certain points in which to get together and make some decisions, or come up with a plan, or do X or do Y, or produce Z. And sadly, not a lot of the people wanted to be there. And I think that for some people, where they struggle is that they've tried all the lovely, beautiful looking Miro templates, and they've tried lots of the tools that Zoom will now give you, for example, but yet their meetings still suck. And decisions still aren't getting made, and people still don't want to turn up. So, Evan, when you think about what you said earlier, and you think about this situation where we're just having terrible get-togethers, I'm not even going to call them workshops or meetings, because get-togethers are not a lot is happening. What do you think are some of the main causes behind just the lack of joy that people experience?
Joy. I always ask participants how many people attend meetings, right? And everyone attends meetings. How many people lead meetings? Not everyone leads meetings. And then I ask them how many people love meetings, and rarely do people say they love meetings. I would say a big problem calls with meetings is we often have meetings and there's no purpose, right? There's no objectives for things. And the metaphor I often like to use with a meeting or a project is the metaphor of a plane flight. Where are you, in London?
Well, I'm just near. I'm near Heathrow.
Okay, so perfect. I'm in Denver. You're in Heathrow. If we're running a project or a meeting, it has three parts. I'm here in Denver. I think last time I was on a plane, I timed it. It took about 52 seconds from the time they hit the jets to wheels up. Not a lot of time, but that's where most of the plane crashes and meetings take place. We jump in. No one has any idea why we're doing things, what we're trying to get done. So if the destination is not clear that it's Heathrow, we're going to end up in Charles de Gaulle in Paris. Now, if we do a good job at the beginning of the meetings, then we set the stage for having a dynamic, powerful meeting. And we're going to get to Heathrow airspace. This is third place, and third part of a meeting is landing. Another place we have really big plane crashes in meetings is on landing. But I'd say the first root cause of bad meetings is the leader hasn't thought through why we're having the meeting, what are we trying to get done, which means they can't design the flight plan. They can't think about creatively how do we get there. They can't think about who should be there and what their roles are. And I would say another problem is people over-invite. They just invite people who have nothing to do with it. Part of that's political and what people say FOMO, fear of missing out, whatever that is. But we have all these people there have nothing to do with it, and we're wasting people's time. But I think most of the causes of poor meetings start before you ever show up, and that's where the real work is.
So you said that it's that work before it begins.
Yeah.
That makes a difference. And you said that we don't do a good job at it. In your experience, or even in your opinion, what would you say a good job really looks like? Because I teach facilitation, and we go through various things, and we try and give people these tools, and we talk about having a clear purpose, but people struggle when it comes to putting pen to paper. What does good really look like?
Good in the meeting itself, or good ahead of time, right?
Ahead of time. Yeah.
Look, if you're running a large project, and let me be clear, I'm not an agile person at all. I just end up training tons of people in the agile space because they legitimately have to run workshop type meetings that require true facilitation. There's a ton of meetings that just should never be allowed out of the hangar, should kill them. But those type of meetings need to happen. And so what good looks like is I'd say in a high stakes meeting, you probably spend 3 times as much time before you ever show up, because you have gotten crystal clear with the sponsor of the project, why they want to do it, what you want to do. You want them there to kick it off. And then you have to do a lot of design on the dynamics. And that's where most meetings go bad, are on the group dynamics. And so you show up with a game plan, and most of the work is ahead of time, and you're running the X's and O's of the meeting once you get in there. But I think one of the most important things is, especially in these virtual meetings is people sit on the screen and we don't hold space for all the voices. Right? And in some ways, I don't know in the UK if they have a big diversity, equity, inclusion push. In the US, of course, it's a huge thing, and no middle-aged white guy like me should represent what they're doing as DEI work, and it's not. But it really is an inclusion program. How do we hold space so that we hear from all voices? I imagine, because you're in the agile space, right, hippo decision making with the highest paid person's opinion. It can often be that middle-aged white guy, senior vice president, who might scare the poop out of everyone on the call. No one says a word. We don't get the right information in the conversation. We sub-optimize the decision. So what we're trying to teach people is the art of how to hear from all the diversity of the group. Because it may well be that junior person who might be introverted, speaking English as a second, third language, person of color possibly, who has exactly the expertise to help a group make a great decision. But there's no structure, so we hear from everyone. And that's what we're teaching people. It's just the art of making sure we have the right conversation and get the right decisions made, and people buy in and they go implement.
So when we're thinking about these situations, which are real for people, and we need to hear from people, because it says, the quiet people have these brilliant insights. And we're thinking about group dynamics. Do you have any little tips, clues you can give to people to help get that inclusion across the board?
One of the simplest ones, and it in many ways can only be done in a virtual meeting, people don't use the chat enough. So what often you can do to get voice from everyone is pose the question you want to hear from everyone. Ask them to wait and type what they want to respond in the chat. Give them plenty of time to think, right? And then generally when we run those meetings, we call them simultaneous chats, where we will put a banner in the chat after people have had time to think. We ask them all to submit at once. And it is one of the simplest things to just give people space to think. And people don't think about how powerful the chat can be, because if we just leave it open and keep talking into the screen, it's the same people, sometimes the hippo. Or if I'm in a mixed hierarchy, it's the senior people who are talking. But if you just use that simple tool, it makes sure everyone has voice, because by making them wait, they know they have to write something. They know they have to. They've had plenty of time to think about it. And by doing the simultaneous chat, people aren't waiting to see what the boss says, she or he or they. And it's one of the simplest tools for inclusion. And then you can go to the chat and ask questions to get people to expand what they're thinking. It's just a simple thing that anyone can do in any meeting.
But very effective.
Very effective.
Very effective. Right. So we mentioned about getting ready for our flight. What does good look like? And then in amongst all the great advice you were giving, you mentioned about group dynamics. Now, there's a episode I've done with a lady called Marsha Acker, who wrote the book, The Art and Science of Facilitation, and she has a new book out now around designing a model for leaving change. And she's a big fan of group dynamics, big fan of a guy called David Cantor. And she got some interesting bits of tips and advice about how to look at group dynamics and codify them. When you're thinking about group dynamics and when you're getting ready for a session, like how can you predict, or how do you get to know what those group dynamics could be?
Look, we're all dysfunctional human beings, right? To get a group of people to make a decision is a minor leadership miracle, because people don't want to make decisions because then they have to commit. But coming back to the framing and the takeoff of the meeting, you're setting the container of how you're going to make decisions by getting the group crystal clear why we're doing this and what the context is, what's in scope and out of scope of the group's decision making. Literally, we always like to reach consensus, right? As long as it doesn't mean compromising to accommodate the most dominant person, it still has to be the best decision. And then good process structure, which is what we're teaching, is what deals with the group dynamic. And then you got to get roles aligned. You have to have working agreements. So setting up the container is what gives you the chance to be able to manage. They're going to be the same dynamics, right? We have egos. We have politics, right? People don't want to say something. They don't want to look good. But it's really what we talk to people about. It's going slow to go fast in the beginning, not just jumping in. with things fuzzy, because when we let the group jump in with things fuzzy, we're going to get a lot of weird dynamics happening in the group. So really, it's the setup for the meeting that gets better, if you will, engagement in a more functional way, given again that we're all dysfunctional. I mean, we're human beings, and most of our dysfunction oftentimes shows up in work. And it's interesting, right? Because if you do the math on meetings, most senior people spend at least 50% of their time in meetings. And so the math on this, if you're spending 50% of your time in meetings and only working 8 hours a day, you will literally spend a year's worth of your life in hours in meetings in under 9 years. So if you have a 40-year career, you're probably going to spend 5 years of your life literally in meetings.
That's very depressing.
It's very depressing. It's very depressing. And I've asked clients for 30 years 2 questions. The first one is, how many meetings take place in your organization? And that's based on scale of the organization, size of the organization, because I work with very small organizations, 20-person nonprofits to gigantic multinationals. But a company with 200,000 people, they probably have 1 million meetings in a day. The second question I ask them is, what's the average effectiveness of the meetings you attend? I've had 2 clients say 80%, maybe 5 say 70%. What I get almost all the time is 50% or lower. And I say to clients, how can you tolerate this? You may run 200,000 meetings today. I'll give you the high bar of 80%, still a B-, but no one ever says that. It is toxic and literally drains the life force out of an organization. And so really meetings, if you want to intervene at the cultural level, that's where you should intervene. Is first of all, somehow organizations need to figure out how to stop a lot of the meetings, right? Just legacy meetings add no value. There are some that we're focusing on that have to happen. And if you transform your leadership, and that's what we're really teaching, is not a course in meetings, but a course in leadership, you begin to transform the performance of the organization. And to your original question, it starts with making sure that takeoff is set up.
Removing meetings.
Right.
They are a scourge. They are incredible life sponges, right? And they just take up all this time. And I don't know how many situations I've been in over the years where people have said, oh, we've got a big problem, we've got too many meetings. And never have I seen it en masse happen effectively where people then say, oh, we're going to have less meetings, so we're going to do X, Y, or Z. What, in your experience, does then help to turn the tide in that? Because I think saying there's too many meetings, saying we put the effort in, I think we only have higher value ones is great. But what have you experienced as the real things that help turn the tide on that kind of meeting tsunami?
The honest thing, that's not what I focus on. Now, I was trained originally by my mentor in the General Electric School workout. I go back a ways, right? I'm going to turn 60 in a week from today.
Well, happy birthday.
And so I go back a ways. But Jack Welch started a workout. And one of the things he was trying to do was to get rid of unnecessary reports, policies, protocols, and of course, meetings. And it is a major cultural push you have to take. So I think it takes a senior leadership C team who realizes we have all this sclerosis, right, in the meeting that's built up. We've got to have some sort of process to blow all those things up, not just meetings, but reports that people have to do, approvals needed. And I'm outside of that arena anymore. At this point in my life, 60 years old, quality of life is the most important thing. So I put my consulting business on the side, and really what I'm doing is making the assumption that the meetings and the people I'm leading have to happen. How you deal with that is, I hope if there's someone who figures it out, they're going to make a ton of money, because you can spend years of your life in meetings. They better be worthwhile.
Yeah, it's funny. I have seen it help when you say to people, there has to be a clear purpose and you have to put the effort in. You find some people who put the effort in, actually they haven't got time to go to as many other meetings because they're purely making sure that the ones they are going to have are effective. But it's difficult. It's difficult. And I agree with you. I think it does take a much higher level kind of direction and purpose setting to say, look, we're not going to carry on in this way. This is just not the way that we should run a business. Now, we mentioned preparing for takeoff. And let's think about them. We're in a workshop. It's high stakes.
Yeah.
Right. And when we say high stakes, Evan, I'd love to. What do you mean by high stakes?
It's a real business issue that has to be solved. It could be redesigning a process, right? It could be deciding where we allocate capital next year. It could be how do we deal with a customer complaint. But it's something mission critical to the business. It's not, there are status update meetings where we have the team meeting weekly or monthly, and there's a lot of reports, presentations. That's not high stakes. This is a meeting where you have a legitimate business outcome that is critical to some sort of business impact. So that's what I mean by high stakes. The meeting should happen, needs to happen. And if we don't get it right, it's going to have an implication on how we effectively are as a business.
Okay. So when you're teaching people how to help them be effective whilst you're in the air and make sure that things are progressing, are there any principles or guiding, what's the word I'm looking for here? Any, like, I suppose it is principles that you ask people to stick to, like unifying rules of what makes a successful high stakes meeting?
Yeah, one of that not only are we taking off at the beginning of the meeting to frame the container for the meeting, but when you're running a workshop meeting, and we in this program, we need to use some platform to teach people how to facilitate. We use two things. We use Google Sheets, and that's a proxy for most organizations using Microsoft Teams and Excel, because that's what most companies use. And then we use Mural. Some of our clients over the pandemic, most of them adopted some sort of whiteboarding platform, whether it's Miro, Lucid Spark. We find Mural to be, they're all similar, but you have to have some sort of platform for engagement. Right? And the model we teach is a simple model called the POPRA model, which just stands for purpose, objectives, process, roles, and agreements. But not only is there a POPRA for the meeting, if you will, but good facilitation is at every moment in a meeting. Why are you doing something? What are you trying to get done? And then you bring good process structure. And so I think the principle would be, you better be clear at every moment what you're trying to get done. And then you got to help a group know how to do it. Because a facilitated meeting is a chain of steps. And those steps all have their own mini poppers, many reasons why we're doing and what we're doing and how we're doing it. And I say one of the simplest things you can do to be a better facilitator is check for clarity more. Make sure the group's aligned and clear before you let them execute a task, right? Whether it's storyboarding or we've all done sticky dot voting in the face-to-face world, and now these murals and Miros have their digital equivalents of those. But it's really about keeping groups crystal clear what they're doing, how they're doing it. And then you can trust the group if you have the right experts and you can bring the right process structure and you have the right purpose and objectives. That's your job. You literally, when you're facilitating, or even as a leader of people who report to you, you don't have to offer your opinion that much. Great leadership is helping a group getting the best decision, getting maximum buy-in. And sometimes they don't even know what you've done because you've had such elegant process structure where they all get to weigh in.
What are your thoughts on a facilitator, either being the facilitator and looking after the process, or a facilitator who has the process but also contributes towards the content?
There's so many different ways people think about leadership, right? And you and I and everyone have read thousands of articles over a career or books on leadership. One of the simplest ways to think about leadership is on a continuum, where on one extreme, you could be focused as the expert. You're the expert in what the system needs to look like. Right? That's one approach. Right? The other extreme is you could remain completely neutral on what let's say the user requirements are for the system, even though you have strong opinions, but you are an expert on that side of the continuum in getting the group to collaborate, to facilitate. Right? Now, in the real world, to your question, we're all in the middle of the continuum. We have opinions and expertise to offer a group. And if we're leading the meeting, we need to be the one who brings the good process structure. And the problem is most people go into a meeting thinking about their expertise and haven't done enough thinking on the process for engaging the group. And the principle we always teach people is Start neutral. Let the group do the work and only move into the middle and start off sharing your expertise when the group doesn't have that expertise to do it themselves. Or if it's your team, there's times you have to provide the guardrails and say, hey, that we'd love to do that, but I can tell you the COO is going to come unglued. And again, part of that then is in the beginning framing, when you do the purpose and context, what is in and out of the purview of the decision making of the group. But the real world, we're going to have opinions. We better be the one who thought about the process structure for the meeting and stay neutral unless the group can't do it for themselves, or you have to provide guardrails because they're about to make a decision that is either a bad decision or is not going to be supported a layer or two up in the organization.
I like that. It reminds me of, is it Chris Hadfield, the astronaut dude, who talks about being a zero and just saying in a group environment, you shouldn't go in and try and help and overhelp and try and show that you are the expert and show that you know what you're talking about. Just go in and be a zero. But when there is an opportunity, when there is a gap, then that's your opportunity to come in and add something to it. And people will respect you for that. But if you go in and you're just trying to show how amazing you are, then you're not going to get much collaboration. You're probably going to piss some people off along the way.
Yeah, and if I'm the senior person who's offering all my opinions and what I think, no one's going to say a word because you have political hierarchy. And so when we work with senior people and try to train them, because these are not just skills in workshops, these are change agent skills, right? These are people leading continuous improvement engagements, doing agile work. They're really much broader than meeting skills. But what we try to teach senior people is, look, your people are going to be intimidated just on the basis of hierarchy. You have to start by asking the group. And one of the mantras we always say is let the group do the work. Never do for the group what they can already do for themselves. And if you have the right people with the right purpose and objectives, they can do a ton more than you think. And if you're really good at guiding the conversation, and what is that? Lao Tzu, Tao Te Ching, right? What was one of those things? Was that we've all heard it. The greatest leader is who, when the work is done, the people say amazing. We did it all ourselves. It really is true. It is amazing what you can get done with good process structure. And you don't have to impose yourself nearly as much as you might think. If you trust the purpose and objectives and trust the group, and you can bring the process, you can trust it. Never say to the group, trust the process. They shouldn't trust the process. They don't know the process. But you, as a leader, can trust the process. And so that's what we're trying to teach people.
And when we say the process, so I'm just making a few notes here. When we say the process, what are we talking about there? Like specific, not in like chapter and verse, but just to give our listeners a bit of an idea. Like, what are we specifically talking about?
Yeah. So most of us have done things like storyboarding or affinity diagramming, right? When we were in the room, we're working on big index cards or big Post-it notes. And process would mean everyone has a chance to reflect silently, as we talked about in the simultaneous chat, but you don't need chat to do that. You frame very clearly what you want the group to write on the sticky notes, how you want them to write. That's process structure. And then you could have a round robin where you go around and hear from everyone, calling things out, writing them on the stickies, getting them on the wall. And then we would go into some sort of multi-voting. Back then it would be sticky dot voting. But the process is how the group engages. So for example, if our meeting objective was to design what the user requirements are for a system, the decision is, what are the user requirements? The process is, how do I get these 10 people to engage? So they're best thinking. So process is just the structure side of the meeting. And in mural, it would be all the moving parts in a Miro or a mural, right? It's also the framing and the takeoff, though, is process structure. Explaining why we're there, what we're doing, explaining the high-level agenda or flight planning, getting roles aligned, right? Who's the timekeeper? Who's the ultimate decision maker? But what's the scribe's role? What's the participant? What's my role? Being more neutral. And then is putting in place agreements, how we interact, how we're going to be on video, how we're going to handle mute, how we're going to handle the tech, don't talk over each other. One of the agreements, though, that often gets left implicit, and this is all process structure, How are we going to decide? We go into so many meetings, it's completely fuzzy how we're deciding, and the meeting just spins, and we don't make the decision. Right? And so that's process structure at the beginning of the meeting. And then when I talk about these mini poppers, these mini steps, every step has its own process. It's the how side of the meeting is what the process is.
Perfect. So you've got all that designed. And then, I don't know if you're familiar with this phrase, the emergent agenda. You've got it all planned out, and it gets all going fantastically, and all of a sudden this thing like pops up, and everyone's like, oh, and it's all like, it's a concern, or it's bright and shiny, and everyone gets focused in on it. How do you suggest that people deal with an emergent agenda versus the plan?
I always say, unfortunately, people show up at our meetings because we got to deal with them, and things are going to crop up. Now, if you've contracted well ahead of time with the sponsor for the meeting, and he or they have signed off on the popper, why we're doing this, what we're doing, right? You design the process for how you're going to do it, and then you're going to get roles and agreements in place. By having that contract, when things crop up, you can come back to the original objectives and say, how many of you think this is outside of scope? And people sometimes, they go on these tangents, and they just lose sight of that. And then we can acknowledge, yes, that's an important issue. It doesn't fit what we're doing here. Let's take it offline, right? Let's take it offline. Now, sometimes there's senior people who they're the ones flashing the shiny object, and they have very strong opinions, and they'll blow up an entire meeting. Even then, they may be the ultimate decision maker. What we still need to do is say, look, this is why we've been asked to do this by the CEO, COO. This is what we're doing. Would it be helpful for you to know what's going to happen if we blow up this meeting to pursue that shiny object? And the other thing we're teaching people is the art of handling challenging people. And when you're neutral, you can't tell senior people what to do or think. They're your boss's boss, and we're trying to train people how to facilitate in high-stakes environments with senior people. But there is an art to handling challenging people. And that's one of the things we practice over and over. But if I don't have clear purpose and objectives, when the shiny object pops up, we can go down this rabbit hole because people lose sight of what we're doing. And so it really is setting the container, having good process structure. And when we hit turbulence, right, using that metaphor, we come back to the headwaters and we're crystal clear what the destination is. And so part of it is just knowing how to take things and intervene, taking things offline or downstream. But it's hard because things are going to crop up. But you've got to be the one who says, no, that's not what we're doing here. And so it really is about discipline. And with senior people, when they're flashing the shiny object, you need to know how to engage the other senior people to take that person on, because you can't take them on if they're your boss's boss. You just don't have the power and authority to do that.
Yeah. So, yeah. Okay. So it emerges. And what we're saying here is, particularly that last point, is if it is a senior person that's raised this new shiny thing and wants to go off on a tangent, is what can you do to get their peers in the room helping to keep it on track? So we're taking off, and then all of a sudden, the equivalent to the emergency exit door blows off. So
that was a little scary recently.
It was a little scary. And those videos of those people, I don't know how. I would be a mess. They look quite composed. I would be in tatters.
I'm sure my underwear would have been soiled if I was on that aisle seat.
Yeah, for those people that don't know, was it a Boeing 737 MAX took off, and then the emergency exit. I'm laughing. I shouldn't laugh. This is serious. The emergency exit door blew off, and there were people sat right next to it, and they're and they were saying if they hadn't had their seatbelts on at that point, they would have got sucked out. So serious event. They had to land. What's the equivalent in a meeting where you have to make an emergency landing and then go back to the drawing board?
It's interesting because, first of all, we're always not realistic about what can get done in a certain time frame, which is why we have to be so good on the front end before we show up designing, and we have to be realistic around, if you want real conversation, you can't jam pack the meeting with too many objectives. But the real world is everything takes longer, and you don't get everything done in a meeting. So what we say to people is, look, if you think about time as fuel, if you're running out of fuel, what we don't say to the pilot is fly faster. Just keep flying faster because you're going to at some point, you're going to run out of fuel. What we say is, look, let's say it's a 2-hour workshop meeting. At least the last 10 minutes are sacred. Even if you didn't get done everything you wanted to get done, which is the real world, at the 10-minute mark, it's coming in for a landing. Because things are going to get taken downstream. That shiny object may have gotten taken downstream and put in things we all use, parking lots. But we got to now deal with that. It's like, okay, we didn't handle the shiny object here. What are we going to do? Given that the shiny object may well be important, it just didn't fit what we're doing today. So we got to close our parking lots. Now, we had objectives. We didn't get everything done, real world. So based on that, what do we need to do with the things we didn't get done? And then we have to, one of the most important things is making sure the group, when they drop off this hybrid meeting or face-to-face, they leave the room, is crystal clear. Who's doing what by when? So there is a coherent action plan. I have so many clients who say accountability is a core value. And then the meetings end, no one has any clue where we're going from here. And so what's must do in the meeting is to have crystal clear next steps, who's going to do what by when. And if you're working with a group over time, the other thing that's so important to do, especially as teams are in the forming, storming, norming model, is to do some sort of process check, just like you would an after-action review, right, in a larger event, that starts getting the group to look at its own group dynamic. So we're getting better and better from a continuous improvement, but that takes time. And a lot of times what the trap we get into is instead of landing the plane, we try to get through the next agenda item that really we were never going to get done. And people are like, gotta go. I got a 3 o'clock. I'm out of here. Eject. And you're sitting there as the meeting leader and everyone snuck out of your meeting and they're happy. They're like, because they have a ton of work. And so they snuck out of the meeting and there were no next steps, which means we have to have another meeting to deal with the fact we didn't do a good job even closing the meeting. And so it's just a discipline of leaving time to close the meeting itself.
Yeah.
And we get a ton of plane crashes there.
Oh, there's lots I'm going to take away from this conversation. And I think we'll begin to draw this to a close because I think we've covered so much. And it's good at times, excuse the pun, time has flown by. I think if there's one thing that I'm really going to take away, it's just silly. I really enjoyed it when you said the plane's running out of fuel. You don't ask the pilot to fly faster. And I think that is such a common mistake that people make, and myself included. Even
we all do.
Yeah, and we just try and speed up when actually we should be taking a moment to take a step back and really look at what we're trying to achieve and figure out maybe what's feasible and focus on things that are valuable. And like you say, make sure that there's people take something away and there's really consequence to what has been agreed, spoken about, rather than just being set up to another meeting, because then it just begins to degrade. People don't see the value in it, and having meeting after meeting and meetings to talk about the meeting. It's just a death spiral, surely. Anyway, Evan, if people want to find out more about you, I'm assuming that they can go onto LinkedIn, because everyone tends to do that anyway. Is there any other way that people can find out something about you?
I'd say you could go on to LinkedIn. You can access our website there. We have a simple website. And look, what we love people to do is encourage them to just send one person to take the program we run. Because we know that person's going to say, this is amazing. All the people should be trained. The program we run is 4 intense days, which is mostly practice. There's 2 hours of lecture in the 4 days. No one's going to sit through 4 days of lecture. I'm not that interesting. My colleagues aren't that interesting. It's primarily people practicing, getting coaching and feedback, because we want real skill transfer. Now, senior clients aren't going to take 4 days. So C-team level people, they're just not going to take 4 days. They should, because they're the ones showing people what miserable meetings look like. But senior people, I always say, come watch for 2 or 3 hours. They'll come in invariably and say, this is awesome. And that's the best way to just find out whether you find this appropriate. Come in and watch for a few hours. So senior people, or even better, send your smartest person, have them take the course, and information's on the website. So if this sounds interesting to you, you can reach out through LinkedIn, grab me there, or through my website.
Awesome. Well, we'll put some details into the show notes as well. Because, I'm tempted. I'm always tempted, though, by training and education. We were talking before we even started recording about how I might take a career change and go and study psychedelics. But, that'd be one pivot too far, perhaps.
Maybe, but I think that intervention might help organizations clean out some of the junk.
Well, do you know what, Evan? When I launch my psychedelic change or leading psychedelic change, then I will absolutely, you'll be the first person to know. On that note, thank you very much, Evan, for coming along. It's been a joy. I've genuinely, fundamentally enjoyed it. There's tons of notes, and I know everyone's going to love listening to it as well. And everyone, thank you for listening. We'll be back again next week with a new guest on a new topic. So please make sure you tune in. Again, thank you, Evan, and thank you, everyone, for listening.